The role that schema plays in Foldkit can't be understated. The entire model, all of your state in Foldkit is represented as a schema. And that unlocks all sorts of really useful things. One example would be the Foldkit dev tools. Like being able to see while your application is running exactly what the entire state of the application is extremely useful. I'd say it's even more useful right now when AI is writing most of the code. Your agent can see exactly what the current state of the model is. And as a human reviewer, you can also see at any given moment what the current state of your model is, even if you didn't write the code. Schema is really the backbone of any Foldkit program, and I don't think Foldkit could exist without it.
Hey, Devin, it's so nice to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. How are you?
I'm doing great. The two of us seem to have quite a few things in common. Both of us started as web designers early on, and now we have a similarly great taste in hats. For those of us who are just like listening and not watching, we're both wearing the OG Effector die hat, which I think you can still get in the merch shop of Effect. Can highly recommend it. But aside from that, would you mind giving a quick introduction who you are? You're the author of Foldkit, which we're going to hear a lot about in a moment. But maybe you want to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Devin Jameson. I'm the author and maintainer of a front-end framework called Foldkit. I am a software engineer. I started my career in tech as a designer and have worked mostly on front-end React projects over the last 7 years, and excited to talk about all those things today.
That's awesome. So beforehand, you already mentioned to me that Foldkit is not just a side project. It now plays a really important role in your creative work life. That being said, you still have a full-time role as well. Are those overlapping in some way? Are you building Foldkit also for work, or are those mostly separate?
They're mostly separate, and I still have a full-time job at August Health that I really enjoy, and Foldkit has just become a kind of a second full-time job that I'm really passionate about. And there are a few ways in which Foldkit has snuck into my full-time work, but for the most part, they're separate. That being said, we do use Effect and really enjoy it.
Okay, got it. This is what I wanted to ask next, and I'm sure we'll cover that quite a bit more in depth. But so Foldkit, I just saw this pop up a few weeks ago on X, and Effect is so rich and so deep. But usually, if there's a community Effect library, it's already good if it has an approachable README. But the Foldkit website really stood out to me, so that already grabbed my attention. Then I saw how extensive and how ambitious the Foldkit project was. With those first impressions, then I also got a bit more of a sense of what Foldkit is even going for. And then I realized, okay, it's actually a fully extensive front-end framework that is not based on React, but competes with React. So that seems super ambitious. And before I want to learn a lot more about the bells and whistles that Foldkit provides, I want to address the elephant in the room. Why build a new front-end framework that is not building on top of React, but is building completely from scratch? So I'm very curious to hear about your motivation, sort of the technical insights behind it, whether you were using React a lot in the past and have certain gripes with it. So walk me through that.
Yeah, I've used React for most of my career, and I think React is a great tool for what it does. And I see React as, well, React is it's a UI view rendering library. And what I've seen over the course of the last 7 or so years is that every React project is architected differently. You end up pulling in a whole host of tools to solve whatever problems you need to solve for that project. Like I've used React with GraphQL and SWR and TanStack Query and RxJS and FPTS and different UI libraries. And it's very flexible, which can be a benefit. I think it also has some drawbacks, especially in the AI world, but we can talk about that later. And so over the years, I aligned on React patterns that I thought worked, and in particular, the ones that I thought worked at quote unquote scale, and the patterns that worked for larger teams. And I think making a React project maintainable came down to protecting that architecture that you'd aligned on. And that's always a big challenge, right? Like you didn't really have an architecture that you could just hold on to. You had to protect it at all costs as new people joined the team and you built more functionality. And as a kind of side quest, I ended up working on an Elm project a handful of years ago and totally changed how I thought about front-end development. Loved it. And then sadly wasn't able to work on any more Elm projects just because of like where the market was and where it still is today. But I took those Elm learnings to my React work. And about a year ago when I started Foldkit, I had some recognition that maybe an Elm architecture front-end framework would be possible in TypeScript with effects. And I didn't feel like there was any way to really do it right without effects. And now we are a year ahead, and it's a real framework that people are starting to use.
Okay, awesome. So I want to understand a little bit more what you mean by architecture in regards to React, since I think there's like multiple dimensions to building a React app, multiple things to consider. I suppose you're not talking about like how to do styling, whether you use like style components back in the days or probably Tailwind today. Like that's not what you're talking about, but it's probably much more of like how does change propagate throughout your application. Like we're not just building a static HTML page anymore, but like we have forms and we have buttons and hover states and context menus, etc. So React has like addressed all of those when it came out in like a much more principled way compared to the jQuery era. In some regards, it has much stronger opinions, but in regards to some other areas, it has much weaker opinions. And I think that part is like most notably how data flows. And I feel this is also where the field of different technologies have forked most like radically. This is where you have systems like Svelte or Solid. And sounds like this is also where you felt the strongest pain when working with React, that you needed to basically protect one uniform way of like architecting the data system behind it, that it kind of fits your way. And this is where, like on that side quest with Elm, you had the most pleasant experience. And now where you're working with Effect, you felt, okay, can we somehow bring those two pleasant ideas, one pleasant idea and one pleasant technology, can we bring them together? Do I roughly frame that in the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. And for those not familiar with Elm uses something called model view update for the architecture, which means you have a single model, which is your application state. That is the only place where application state can live. Your view is a pure function of the model. And update is where transitions happen, where you go from previous state of the model to the next state of the model. So it's a highly constrained architecture, but through those constraints, you gain a kind of freedom. Like in the same way that if you're working on a creative project, if you give yourself constraints, you can oftentimes find yourself being more productive. That's what a lot of people find in the Elm architecture.
Got it. So, and if we rewind the clock a little bit, I mean, Realm has been around for a very long time. I think some people still use it, but I think at the back when I remember it kind of coming to be, was around about the same time when React also really started becoming popular. And one technology took React by storm early on, which was Redux. And so I think Redux and Elm had a lot of like similarities. I think I don't recall like the exact details back then anymore. I think Dan Abramov back then, like I'm sure he was like aware of Elm and maybe wanted to bring some of the best ideas of Elm to React. But I think this is also like for people who have maybe never had the pleasure to build something with Elm, but maybe they had the pleasure of building something with Redux back then. I think that's like the closest analogy.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm 95% sure that Redux was inspired by Elm. Like that's why Redux exists is because of Elm. I've only worked with Redux very, very briefly, like a handful of years ago. And yeah, I think it's a nice tool for state management in React. It makes state management more principled, which I would argue is the most challenging thing in building complex React applications. That being said, it doesn't solve the controlled, explicit side effects problem that Elm solves. So I'll leave it there and we can figure out whichever direction we want to go.
Okay. No, this helps a lot. And I think this is the most important part for me, and I imagine like most listeners, to not just like dive right into the technology, but first asking like, why does the technology exist? Since like departing from React is a big leap, since I think even though you mentioned that most React apps are kind of built in a different way when it comes to the data architecture, etc., yet it brings a huge level of familiarity. And if you worked at one company before that uses React and now you come in a new one that uses React, there's still a lot of like knowledge that is transferable, which you need to think through twice when you switch to a different technology. But there is precedent for that with Solid and Svelte, etc. And I think it's really understanding what is the pain point that is so severe, or where is the opinion diverging so much that it really like that fork in the road is worthwhile. And I think this confirms my understanding that it's all about like how data management, state management, change management within a front-end application and an ambitious front-end application works, and also in a way that it is convenient, intuitive, and clear for humans and now also agents to work. That like you don't just build like a little form, but you build a massive system out of it that is composable, etc. And I think back then when I looked at Elm compared to React, I think what just spoke to me is that you kind of flip the gravity. Everything in Elm was centered around this idea of like how data flows, where in React everything was kind of centered around components and more of like how the view works. And I think here you're taking like the same bet again, where you say like, what if we re-envision this around how data flows, where like the view part is almost like a commoditized problem at this point. So yeah, I'm very curious, like with that anchoring, how you've probably like studied the existing like technologies. You've probably studied Solid. You've probably studied Svelte. If we disregard React, what have you like looked at those technologies and what did you like, and where did you feel like no, actually, I want to take even a larger departure?
Good question. There's a lot I want to say. So I don't have a deep understanding of Solid or Svelte. I think in order to develop a deep understanding of a technology, you really need to build something quote unquote serious. And I haven't had the opportunity to do that professionally. That being said, I do know that Solid uses fine-grained reactivity, and so it's really fast, and you're updating just the DOM nodes that need to be updated, and I think Solid has benefits for that reason. Svelte, I know less about. The thing that I can say pretty confidently about both Solid and Svelte is that, like React, neither of them solves architecture. They are bring your own architecture, decide your own architecture, or have your agent decide your own architecture tools.
And when you say architecture, you mean purely in the realm of the front-end app. We're not talking about API, microservices, queues.
Yes.
We're just talking about like the client-side experience, whether this is like a calculator that's like doesn't have any server state, or whether you're building a Facebook client that talks over an API. We're just talking about the front end.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying. So they don't solve front end architecture, and specifically, what I mean by front end architecture is how exactly do you manage state? How exactly do you manage side effects? How do you manage browser resources that you might need to pull in? How do you manage ongoing streams of data that are updating state in your application? That's the hard stuff about front-end development. Once you have developed a sufficiently complex system that is, maybe local first, right? I work on local first stuff at August Health, and it gets complicated once you start dealing with a local database and a remote database and complex forms. And so going back to your question, I think for a handful of reasons, a highly opinionated framework that prescribes the architecture is extremely useful right now for both humans and AI. And I can keep talking about this, but I'll throw it back.
I think you're spot on. You've mentioned that Foldkit is opinionated, and I had exactly the same observation. This is why it spoke to me. It's not just opinionated about the data architecture, but now also takes the bet on being opinionated about a particular underlying technology, which is Effect, which brings us all here. And I think this is what makes it maybe a more risky bet for someone else to adopt. But for the people who are already in the fold, no pun intended, with the Effect ecosystem, I think that for them is like even more attractive this way. If supposedly that the architecture is exactly the way how they think about it, and I think it's a very, very good default, now you're also opinionated and therefore embrace what the Effect ecosystem gives us. And I think that unlocks a lot that other technologies, whether React or Svelte, they're much more agnostic to many things, which is also a good thing. This way they're like maintain their optionality, and like people can use it with many different things, and there's integrations, but it will never be as good and as natively integrated as a technology that really fully embraces the underlying technologies. And I think there is like another side of a coin when we talk about data. Like, sure, it's like the architectural part is how does data flow? What is the source of truth? What is derived? What happens when? Events are like obviously like super important when you build an interactive application. But that data always has a shape, and that data has constraints. And I think, therefore, like Foldkit is sort of like the first front-end framework that acknowledges that and doesn't just like give you a like loose type where like in the next moment you can say as any, and like there's no like really hard validity to that data. But now you're embracing Effect, and therefore you're also embracing Effect schema, which I think is it's a huge unlock here where you can absorb a lot of complexity, whether like in all parts of the system. Like we're probably going to talk about like forms and other things, but we have like in a modern front-end app, you have so much data just like moving around all the time, and all that data you need to know what you're working with. And I feel this is like another huge unlock that you're embracing here that I think makes the entire bet really worth it.
I would agree. Of course, I'm biased, but I would agree. And I think the role that schema plays in Foldkit can't be understated. I mean, the entire model, all of your state in Foldkit is represented as a schema. And so that's really the foundation of any Foldkit program. And that unlocks all sorts of really useful things. Like one example would be the Foldkit dev tools. Like being able to see while your application is running exactly what the entire state of the application is extremely useful. It would have been really useful 5-10 years ago. I'd say it's even more useful right now when AI is writing most of the code, and AI can, your agent can see exactly what the current state of the model is. And as a human reviewer, you can also see at any given moment what the current state of your model is, even if you didn't write the code. So yeah, schema is really the backbone of any Foldkit program, and I don't think Foldkit could exist without it.
In that regard, I mean, you're not using that language on your website, but like now I'm thinking about Foldkit sort of as not just an effect first front-end framework, but also like a data and schema first front-end framework, which I think a lot of like form libraries, etc., maybe have sort compatibility or now standard schema compatibility, but you're taking this way further. And like once you start embracing a schema, and like with my background, having created Prisma back then, like working on Live Store, etc., like schemas are always at the core of like, you can't have data without schemas. Like, sure, you can like say you're going with like MongoDB and say like everything is schemaless, but like your data has a shape and form no matter what. What is like very messy and like can take like 10 different forms, okay, but there's still, ideally you still model that with like a union of a schema. So I think this is something aside from like the architecture, like you could even make a different composition of like your bets and trade-off. Like you could, for example, say we're going with React, but we're baking schemas like right into it, and like we leave the data architecture a little bit more like agnostic. But I think here, like you're just like taking two super strong points together. There's like schema with a schema-full data and the Elm architecture. And that is the foundation. And so to my understanding, if we just like look into what Foldkit provides, it is like very extensive already. So if we can just maybe do a little bit of like a comparison, like if you look at Foldkit, compare it to something like React or something like Solid or Svelte, where would you say there's already parity, and where would you say there's like the biggest gap still? I suppose there's like no equivalent to React Native yet, but when we're just talking about like the web as a front end, like how should I think about parity versus open gaps?
Yeah, I think the biggest gap between Foldkit and React is ecosystem, and that's a big gap, right? Like there's a huge ecosystem of React tools that you can just pull into your project and use. And I think at this point, on most of the other fronts that matter for developing web applications, Foldkit is at or very close to parity. And I think Foldkit also has benefits that React structurally cannot have because of what React is. You mentioned earlier that React is like the unit of composition in a React application is the component. And a component is managing state, it's managing side effects, it's managing caching, like memoization, it's managing the view. And that's how you write React applications. You make a component, and then you make another component, you make another component, and you nest them. And what tends to happen is your state and your effects and your caching and all this stuff just accumulates across dozens of components. And this is like often if you're doing like a really good job, like if you're a really good React developer, like this is just how it works. Foldkit is, you kind of said, it kind of like flips it on its head, and it says, no, like there's no concept of a component that does something locally. Instead, we're going to have a global model. We're going to have explicit messages, which are the precursor to updating the model. We're going to have explicit effects, which are actual effects and are called commands in Foldkit, which we can get into. And the view is going to be a pure function of the model. And so React, we're kind of trading the like local flexibility of React for this globally coherent system. And I think that like that is a lot more beneficial than it sounds on its face. Like that unlocks all of the cool things that you get with Foldkit, and that AI agents can also leverage Foldkit.
Yeah. So, I mean, designing good abstractions, I feel like this is like one of the most ultimate forms of like being an accomplished engineer, that you have like opinions on that, and you can like actually like go further than the abstractions that there were before. I think this is what really blew my mind about effect and like Zio before that, and like always had like a lot of like admiration for functional programming. And I feel effect has really brought it to a point where it's not just like academically brilliant, but like also practical. And I feel like one of the highest goals there is always composition. I mean, when we're building applications, our ambition level doesn't decrease, quite the opposite. There's devices can do more things than ever. We now need to make them responsive. We need to we're trying to make them work offline. We need to there's so many things, that so much entropy which we need to somehow model in our application. So it's a matter of how can your application even stomach that? How can even whether it's coding agent, whether it's you, there's just lines of code adding up and adding up, and you now kind of need to, having the amount of complexity is one thing. How densely can you express that in a way where you differentiate between accidental complexity and existential complexity? I think ideally a system has close to no accidental complexity, but it's all existential complexity. But then it's a matter of how do you organize that? And when you organize that and you can compose it well together, then the overall complexity of your system miraculously shrinks. And I think this is the underlying abstractions that unlock that almost as an emergent property, that if you model your application in this way, the overall complexity of your system is lower than with another technology. I think that's the money shot here. And I think this is maybe you have thoughts on how the compositional emergent behavior of building an application with Foldkit compares to something with React. So you've talked about components versus views and models and commands, etc. So I'm curious, walk me through the insights that you had. I suppose a lot of that was also already based on the insights that formed Elm. But walk me through those insights, then also illustrate a bit how I should think about that compositional behavior. I remember when I used React, I had those aha moments where a lot of the complexity that I had in previous applications kind of disappeared when I used React. The same thing happened with Effect. And so I suppose you wouldn't be building this if you wouldn't believe that it even has a superior compositional behavior. So I'm curious to learn more about that.
Yeah, I really like what you said about accidental versus existential complexity. And I would tend to agree that, well, I'd put it this way. I think if a program is really complex, it should look complex. And then as you look more at it and you dig in and you understand it, that complexity should unfold and become clear as you develop your mental model of what you're looking at.
I amend that in one way, in that regard, that I'm almost thinking about this as a fractal, where you basically have a shape, and ideally that high level shape doesn't even look that complex, but you're wondering, how does this work? And then you zoom in, the other complexity that you have zoomed away from disappears, and now you can look a little bit more at the inner encapsulated complexity. So I think it's basically about like what is localized, as much that can be localized that belongs together. I think that's the thing to aim for.
Yeah. And I think when I look at, like, in particular, effect code, even if it's really complex, if I zoom in and I look at what's happening locally, I feel like I can trust what's happening. And then I can zoom back out, and given what I trust about what's happening locally, I can develop this global understanding of what's happening. And I think that it's very honest to what is being modeled. And I think Foldkit is doing the same thing, in large part because it is kind of effect, like it has its own architecture, but complex Foldkit code like doesn't look super straightforward and like easy when you like first look at it. But then you look at it more and you're like, oh, okay, I get it. This is honest. This is clear. And do you want to respond before
one observation on that as well? I think there's so many parallels between Foldkit as a project that builds on top of Effect, but also Effect itself. I think the trade you're making with Effect is like you're learning a little bit more of like a complex toolkit, like wrapping your head around like what an effect is takes maybe a tiny bit longer than wrapping your head around like what a function is. But once you have a very complex function, you've understood the concept of a function, but looking at that very complex implementation of a particular function gets a lot harder. Whereas like if you have it expressed in effects and you've already like have your check mark of like understanding what an effect is, now you look at that and that's actually simpler. And I think it's a similar trade here with Foldkit. Like you need to build an intuition and internalize what does it mean? Like for some, what does a model mean? What does a view mean? What does a command mean? But once you have that, now that lowers sort of the complexity, like entry price for something. And you have that richer vocabulary that your application that you want to model, that shrinks to that existential complexity.
Absolutely. And so in terms of, you mentioned composition. Maybe I'll talk about that for a second. And then I think this could be a good point to actually look at some code. I think it could be helpful.
Yeah, I think if you think it would be most beneficial to like illustrate that through code, let's certainly do it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Before we dive into that, like broadly how I think about composition in Foldkit is I strive to make every piece of Foldkit, whether it's model, message, update, view, command, subscriptions, etc. And almost all of that comes directly from the Elm architecture. So I didn't invent this. There are a few pieces that are new, but the seams between them need to be super like airtight. And they each do exactly what they say they do and nothing else, like ever. So you can trust that this is doing one thing, you fit it with this thing, and then together you get some more complex, interesting behavior. So that's how I think about it. And let's look at some code.
Awesome. So you're going to share your screen in a second. Which domain, like when you build Foldkit and like you don't just build the system, but you've also done a fabulous job of like creating a website for it, creating documentation for it. And now like the job of the documentation is for other people to like form an intuition. And so you had to also pick examples that like that are most well suited to illustrate the powers of Foldkit without overwhelming a user to like absorb the domain first. So I'm also very curious to hear more about that.
So yeah, in terms of examples, I started, of course, with the counter example, and then just tried to make something a little bit more complicated, and run into issues that I couldn't support, like with the current framework. And so that's really just how the examples have evolved. And so I think if you go through every example, they'll progressively get a little bit more interesting and complex. And that's a great way to learn. about the framework.
Got it. So you're sharing your screen. You have on the left side for those who are just like listening in. Maybe now is a good time to pop out your phone and like look on the screen. Not while you're driving, please. Or if you want to like look at this later, you can also like find all the code snippets, etc. Probably in the Foldkit repo. And we try our best to like give you an intuition for what that looks like just on audio. But it's probably best to just like look at the screen sharing here. But what immediately stands out to me, I suppose we're gonna see in a moment the source code for like an actual application. The application we're seeing here is not just like a counter, but it's an app called Pixel Forge, it seems, and it seems like a little like a mini Photoshop paint kind of thing. But this is already like a not a trivial kind of application that I think will probably demonstrate the capabilities quite well. So that's to be said about the application. And about the code. This is the very first time I'm like looking at Foldkit source code besides the docs. And what stands out to me here is I have now a pretty good intuition for what React code feels like. I think most of us have, and I have a good intuition for what idiomatic effect code is. And this is the first time I'm seeing those things side to side, and like where it feel like I'm getting a first taste of what idiomatic Foldkit code looks like. And like my first impression, like first impressions, I think here are always like an interesting thing is really nice. There's a few controversial parts about Foldkit for some. For example, I think Foldkit doesn't have JSX, which we're gonna see in a moment. But my first impressions are really really nice.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just give a quick demo here of Pixel Forge. So it's a pixel art app. It's very simple. You can draw stuff. You can change the color. You can do fills. You can, let's see, you can do this mirror thing, which is kind of fun. So if I go to brush and then do that, now I'm mirroring.
Oh, nice.
I can mirror in both directions. So yeah, it's just fun. Fun little pixel art app. So we'll make something kind of cool here.
I'm already noticing about the pixel art app here is, besides like all the tools you've demonstrated, etc., on the right side, I'm seeing a stack of like what looks like the history of what has happened.
Yep.
And I have a feeling this is what I remember about Elm and what I remember about Redux. Something time travel. So yep. I think there's like a first class benefit of working with Foldkit, at least in this app.
Yeah. So undo, redo, going back to previous states in the model and going forward falls out very naturally from the architecture. So of course, this is something you can do in any framework or without a framework. But in Foldkit programs, this tends to just be a lot easier to manage. Yeah. So yeah, we can go back, we can go forward. So and the idea here was, we can also just save our pixel art. So the idea here was to create something that was non-trivial, but still approachable. And then I'll also just touch on this while we're here. This is the Foldkit DevTools. So we can see at any moment what the state of the application is. So like this is our grid. These are all our pixels right here. We can see.
And so the DevTools are basically just like a thing that lives inside of the web app itself.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep. And then for any given message, we can see we entered cell X19, Y16 here. And
got it.
Yeah. Yep.
So the DevTools basically gives us a view into the current model, which I suppose is the current state of the live application, but also the messages. So anything kind of like the events, anything that has happened within the application. I guess we'll also hear more about like what is the message, what is the command, but there are also commands and there seem to be it's a little bit small, but it's just like mounts, I suppose.
Yep. Yeah, I can make this a little bigger too.
Yeah, we'll shelve that for a moment and like walk through a bit of like how the application is built from a code perspective. But I like the example app as something that is like a nice balance of not just a counter. So it's reminiscent of like a real like non-trivial application that has probably all aspects of what is important. Has like little forums, has like little like real-time reactivity, etc. So yeah, let's dive in through the code. And like what we see here in the code is, as for every effect app, there's always like your main, like the thing that the entry point you run, and we have the same thing here.
Yep. So this is the entry point for a Foldkit program. Conventionally, it's called entry.ts. This is where you make your program and then you hand it to the Foldkit runtime to run it. So making your program means pulling all of these pieces together. So our model, which is our schema representation of the entire application state. I'll skip flags for a moment. Init, this is your initial model. So you need to tell the program, where do we start? Update is your transition function. How do you get from one model to the next model given a message? View, pretty self-explanatory. It is a pure function of the model. Subscriptions, I'll also skip this for the moment while we're getting into the basics. Container, where you're going to mount it, and then some dev tool stuff. So that's it. And then making a Foldkit application is just deciding what all of these pieces are and describing them.
Got it. Yeah. So what do you feel like is we have a lot of different like entry points now to choose from. I suppose the model is probably just a collection of different schemas. So maybe that's a good starting point.
Yep. And I kind of like you driving this because it's like you're seeing this for the first time and getting a sense for like what's happening. I think that's a nice way to go through
imagine like we're working on this project together. I'm opening the repo the first time. And so I'm now like trying to form an intuition. Like having used the app has already helped form an intuition. So now I'm wondering, okay, so we have this grid thingy. Okay, I see the grid in the model. And like all of this feels immediately familiar because it's just effect schemas. So yeah, this is, I mean, we don't need to spend too much time on that. This is like a very concise way of like how you've modeled the application, which is like always like a orthogonal concern in the first place that speaks to the experience of an engineer. Like how good are they to model like the application state. And I think one thing where you and I certainly share the same vision. Like I'm a huge fan of like the Elm architecture where you separate the state that you materialize from events. So here you're modeling the state as a model, and all of that is like you probably don't mutate that model state directly, but you probably derive it from something that's happening. So maybe we look at that counterpart.
Yeah. So let's look at message. I think that's the next thing.
But maybe just like one thing to like acknowledge here, what we've seen, like that we have a schema to model encode the shape of our data. This is already kind of like a world's first in at least like the TypeScript frontend world, where like we, as a starting point, we're not looking at like how does the view work, etc. Like how does the data work? And I think this is already like I feel right at home here, and I think most effect developers will feel right at home. Like this is very similar to how you build a effect app. Is like I typically start by like just thinking about like what sort of data do I have in this effects program, and it's like just the same here, just with like one layer of an opinion on top where you separate events from state. And I think this makes a ton of sense.
Cool. All right, on to messages. So messages represent facts about what happened in your application, and they are what feed into the update function, which is where the next model is derived. So to look at how state updates or how the model updates in a Foldkit application, the first place to look is the message union, because this tells you everything that happened that could result in a state change.
Got it. So this is basically when we clicked around in the app, we like selected a different color or like we drew some pixels. This is like when the app says like, yes, that has happened, it becomes a message.
Yeah, exactly. So if we do pressed cell here, so we'll actually click pressed cell. We'll see here, pressed cell, message, X5, Y3. And then if we actually go look at pressed cell here, we'll see it is a message, pressed cell, with a payload of the X, which is a schema number, and Y, which is a schema number.
It is a little bit more than just a schema. It is a schema, and it is, or like a struct, and then has a name. I suppose, is that mostly just for like the dev tools or to like persist some state? Why do I need to like provide that pressed cell name?
This is the tag. So this is how the update function figures out what message this is.
Okay. So it's basically like a tag struct. Okay.
Yep,
got it.
exactly. Yep. Yeah. M is just a tag struct under the hood that is callable. So you don't have to do .make. And there's a clear convention for making messages.
Okay. Got it. Okay, cool. So yeah, we have now those two different parts. There's probably you've mentioned the update function where like probably from different messages, you get to keep the model state up to date. I suppose those are just like pure functions that where you can like splice in your data. Okay, there seems to be some interesting stuff here going on with an interesting like API. So what am I looking at here?
Yep. So this is the update function. And what's happening here is we are matching on the message.
Got it. So we're using the effect match module.
Correct. So update function takes the current model, takes the message. We use match from effects, .value on the message. This is just so it can infer the return type. And then we handle every message. So here,
very straightforward.
Yep. And
so
correct.
we take in the old model. That's the old model state, whatever. It might be the initial one. It might be we've already done something. And then we take the new message. The message could be anything. So now we basically just need to match over that message. And like in the case of where like whatever you've clicked, the message is delete everything, then we delete everything. That makes sense.
Yep, exactly. And you also mentioned pure function. Yes, update is a pure function. And that means that every time it runs, given the same input, it'll give you the same output. And so just to go through this like very quickly, if the tool that is currently selected in the model is fill, when the message comes in, we do some work to figure out what the next model is. We apply a fill, we push history. So these are just other functions. And then we return the next model. And then there's this other thing. So there's this next model.
Yeah, I'm seeing a few things here besides just like a pure function that returns the next model, but we're returning a tuple of the next state that we want. And there's like a second thing in the tuple, which I'm curious what that is. And there seems to be a function, maybe it's a helper function called evo, maybe evolution. Or evolve. That's my intuition, but like, yeah, what are we looking at here?
So evo is very similar to struct.evolve. In fact, it actually uses struct.evolve under the hood, but it provides some stricter typing. So you can't have keys that don't exist in the struct that is being passed in.
So it's a safe, a safe mutation, basically.
Yep.
Got it.
And then there's this other piece that we return. So we return the next model, but we also return an array, and there's one element in that array, and it's save canvas next model.
Right.
So this is where commands come in, because side effects need to happen in applications.
Okay. So yeah, how does and maybe just before looking at that, this is like one of the tricky ways how you like model that in a front-end framework. This is where React's like you gotta like choose a way of dying somehow. Like React's way is the notorious React.useEffect. You need to perform that somewhere, and like with React, you get all I suppose like a huge percentage of just the inherent complexity of a big React app, or possibly even like the accidental complexity of a big React app, is to figure out like how do I do the stuff in the use effect, in which order does it happen, like do I consider all the cases, what about the dependency array here? And so you're providing a different way of like to think about this. So given there's probably a fair amount of nuance to this, we can probably only go so deep. But I'm very curious to like hear about the insight behind this and how that unlocks like better, saner composability.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, this comes directly from Elm. This is the Elm architecture through and through. Commands are an Elm concept that Foldkit has inherited.
Got it.
And the reason this exists is the update function needs to be pure. And it's really useful. It's core to the architecture that the update function is not doing anything. It is just describing things. It's returning the next model, and it's returning a description of the side effect that the runtime will then manage. And this is like where the effect, it's, not broadly, but like the effect type comes in, or the effect value.
And can you just, before we're looking at that, can you briefly explain and sort of the intuition of the app? Like, what is the non-pure thing that is happening here? Like, is it basically because it draws something, or it could like play a sound or something? So that's not what makes it not a pure function in this case?
Yeah, good question. So in this case, we want to save the canvas to local storage. So like when I refresh, we don't want our canvas to go away. That's impure because it's a side effect. Yep.
Got it. Well, for anyone who thinks like, wait, isn't like local storage saving, isn't that like a synchronous function? Yes, it's a synchronous function, but that doesn't make it pure. There's like many bad things that can happen.
Yep. So if we actually go look at this, save canvas is really simple.
Okay, so it's like it's a function that you've just like derived from a DSL called command.define. So a command is, it looks like this is basically just a little helper around an effect.
Yes, it is an effect with a name and potentially some arguments that are required for the effect to run.
Okay, got it. So a function that returns that makes sense. And like, I think this is also an interesting like observation here. I remember when I first learned about effect and like over 6 years ago, and I was obviously had much more experience with React back then compared to effect. And I like why effect spoke to me is because I can use it everywhere. I can use it on the back end. I can use it in the front end. But in the front end, I was pretty clear that it had to coexist with react somehow. So I need to figure out like, how do I make those two things like happily coexist? Who calls whom? What is the entry point? And like slowly but surely, I tried to figure out like some patterns. Over time, the community also figured out some patterns. But I think up to till today, there's still like not the one way to do it best. Like, do you have like, who's the boss? Is React the boss and just like calls out
Right.
to effect once in a while? Is effect the entry point, and like effect is kind of responsible for like managing React? And like, where do you like, I want to have my effect somewhere, but like, where's the entry point? Do I have one big one, etc.? And so you give us a very elegant answer here. Like, commands are the entry points for like, this is the thing that like manages the effects and calls the effects. And in a very like, I mean, this is probably was for you a very delightful moment, I suppose, when you like realized that the Elm concept of a command fits so smoothly together with effect.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. That was kind of the original insight. Was that like, this looks a lot like a command in Elm, and it does way more, but it fit into that box that was needed to do this right.
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of an aha moment right here. Like, I'm glad that we started with like the more boring parts, like understanding the model, understanding the messages, but now understanding, okay, for the updates, this is where like the boring data transformation happens. But like in some cases, you also want the tricky, effectful things happen, and this is exactly happening here.
Yep, exactly. So in this case, this is a good place to start because it's really simple. If people are familiar with effects, this will make a lot of sense. We have this browser key value store dependency. I mean, this is the other great thing about, I think, working this way is like, this is just effect, right? There's nothing like Foldkitty special happening here. This is just effect. And so,
by the way, a nice mascot. Yeah. You got to have a Foldkitty.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah. and then we do our store.set. And then at the end here, we just return a message back into the update function. So in this case, the completed save canvas, when it reaches the update function, I don't think it does anything because we don't really care that local storage just saved. But if this were an HTTP request, we would get some data here. And then this is how our data would flow back into update. We would update our state.
Got it. Yep. Awesome. But what I just like reflecting on what we've seen so far, I'm like predisposed to the ideas of like separating events from state, like the Elm architecture, etc. I think it's really like embraced by many different technologies. Also, if you like maybe you've used XState in the past, like a lot of those, like it's all the same ideas, but just absorbing those concepts now and like seeing how they're exposed in Foldkit, there's like unlike effect maybe where I had to like the first time I was introduced to a layer. It took me quite a while until I had an intuition for what a layer is or like how streams work, like in all the different cases. But what I'm seeing here, I feel already pretty confident, like having an intuition for how this works in the various scenarios. Like, given that I can inherit now my understanding from an effect, that gives me an understanding of like how abortion works or like how different things can be composed together. So yeah, this feels very smooth so far.
Cool. Glad to hear that. So in terms of other things that I think are interesting to look at for this example, I want to touch briefly on testing, if that's cool.
So, I mean, we haven't closed the loop yet on one thing, which is probably like the most like straightforward.
Oh, the view. I totally forgot.
Yeah, exactly. We have so far.
How can I forget?
Data and like and side effects, but we gotta have some pixels. So how does that look like? And this is where we're introducing trigger warning. We're not looking at JSX here.
Yeah, it's not JSX. Okay. So view. So this is the top level view in Foldkit. View takes a model, returns a document. So this includes the title and then also the actual body content, which you can see here. And
okay, so I feel like this is just because we're like so used to like JSX-y things by now. Like I want to absorb that a little bit and then also ask like to better understand like your opinions here. And maybe this was like a clear choice for you. Maybe this was like also a non-trivial choice for you. But what we're looking at here, like first of all, it's a view.ts, not a TSX file. And like what is similar to a React component is like basically a function that takes some stuff and returns, in this case, a document. So that's interesting. Is a document here, is that the DOM document or is that like a document coming from Foldkit?
Yeah, that comes from Foldkit and it represents the title and the body.
So you're basically with Foldkit, you have like a bit of a mapping to like what ultimately becomes DOM, but like it's basically just like you're returning just a normal object. The title, I suppose, like you could return other things here as well, and the body you're now composing out of those little helper function h dot. H seems to stand for like a helper that you've constructed out of a help HTML function that is parametric over our messages. So at least on a type level, which probably helps us to avoid certain like bad invocations. So I suppose like coming from React, maybe that takes a little bit of well, as humans, we don't write code anyway anymore. So and the agent like immediately adapts to anything.
Yep.
But just to read it, this is a little bit of a departure. But in a way, it's also like it's just normal TypeScript. I think I have an understanding of like how it works. Now I'm more curious about what made you choose this direction as opposed to like following what most people are doing and using JSX.
Yeah, great questions. So the first reason is that to some extent Foldkit is part of the Elm lineage, and you don't have something like JSX in Elm. This is how views are constructed. And I really grew to like that. And so like, that's where I started, right? Just like as a personal preference beginning, I was like, I really like the way that this looks. I like the way that it composes. I like that everything is just like a function or a list that just feels natural to me. And then on top of that, I think at the type level, supporting JSX could be really tricky. I haven't looked super deeply into it, but this kind of typing where all of these attributes only work with your message type that you provide is probably a pretty tricky thing to do with JSX, and I'm not sure it's even possible.
Okay.
So yeah.
No, this makes sense. And I've been like often felt held back by where TypeScript was very capable and JSX was not. For example, like how you have with effect like layers and the context, how you can basically say like, this effect requires a key value store. Like you forget, you lose all of that information when you compose React components. Also like error boundaries, etc. So yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So like the sort of like stylistic choice aside, I'm now curious how I should think about like data flow here. So the header, I suppose, that's like very boring, doesn't have like any interesting data things happening to it. But let's look at something that's like more reactive. So how do I get my data? And how should I think about this? Like, is there with React and hooks, the same function component basically gets recalled all the time with like the rules of hooks, which takes quite a bit of like getting used to. And at some point it's like you're used to it and like you embrace it. Is there something similar happening here? Or how should I think about reactively updating my view here? Like, where does data come from? When does what get re-executed?
Yeah, good question. So this is made really much simpler because compared to React, because the view is just a pure function of the model. So there's no life cycle of a particular view. There's some machinery for batching messages and handling renders in a performant way, but basically on animation frame, view is called with the model, and then the rendering happens.
Okay,
and then
so that's interesting already.
Yeah.
So you're basically re-rendering the entire app every frame,
with the exception of lazy or memoized components. Yes.
Interesting.
Yep.
Okay. I'm very curious to learn more about this. Like, on the one hand, like, that's how games work, and that's fine. Like, we have capable devices, and in a way, it's almost like a good forcing function to keep bottlenecks away, because like if it happens on every render, you'll notice much more quickly. Yeah, it's an interesting trade-off where I hope it affords you a lot of simplicity. And I think we're all like so afraid of like historically that, oh, this gets called more often, but it's actually fine. React has different bottlenecks that are much more noticeable in real React apps compared to like rendering it all the time. There's like one anecdote or like one situation that really comes to mind. There's like a very gifted engineer, Cheng Lu. He worked back then at Facebook on the React team. He showed me this demo once where it was basically a image gallery and also Hacker News clone that has like infinite scrolling. He probably built the largest data set he could find and like really tried to build a very, very ambitious application with us. The image, like both the image gallery as well as the Hacker News version. Like, he demonstrated scrolling. The Hacker News version, for example, always had like nested comments that were all differently sized. The image gallery had like very smooth like animation from the grid into details, etc. Like, those things were abortable. And this felt like buttery smooth. So first I basically thought, okay, he's showing me like a native Mac app, until I realized this was like a web app. And I've never seen such a fast and smooth web app before. Like, he really like showed to me how capable the web platform could be. And I've asked him like, hey, how did you build this? And he did the exact same thing. He basically said like, I'm basically just re-rendering the entire app on each animation, on each frame. And the thing that made it fast is by not having to do all of like the crazy machinery that React gives you. So there's probably like situations where one is a better trade-off than the other. But if he would have said that to me without giving me this demo first, I would have thought he's crazy. But like, having seen the demo, was the ultimate proof that this is a very attractive trade-off. So I'm very, very interested in like seeing how that plays out.
Yeah. I think it sounds like at first blush, it sounds like, well, if you're recomputing the whole view on every animation frame, then that sounds really bad for performance. But I don't think that that's the case. Like, that's the same thing that Elm does. They just have a really, really good VDOM diffing and patching solution. And so right now, I actually did like a big performance push. So Foldkit was very slow because I just wasn't thinking about performance. Because like, why think about performance when like I'm the only person using this and I have been for the last 9 months, and like my mom knows about it, you know? But then it got to a point where it was like, oh wow, like people are using this, they want to use it more, so let's think about performance. And the main thing was just getting effect out of the hot path. Just because like on every render, if you're doing a bunch of effect gen and you're like pulling in like dispatch, it's just doesn't really make sense. So just like making all that as like vanilla and optimized as possible went a long way. So right now, if you do the to-do MVC benchmark with like 100 to-dos, an optimized Foldkit application is about as fast as a unoptimized React 19 application. So and optimized means using create lazy to memoize parts of the tree. And in my mind, that's good enough for V1 production use.
I mean, this is, I think, also analogous to effect here. Is effects for like a certain kind of shaped program, is effect the fastest way to run that in JavaScript? Probably no, but other things matter way more. Like how can you like really unlock the like IO bottlenecks that you have in your application? Like how can you build like that you're not like penny wine pound foolish here, but that you actually optimize what matters. And I think what matters in a front-end app, sure, you don't want to have it lag, but like you want that it gives you the affordances of a complex and ambitious front-end app. And I think this is where the thing that actually matters is like the complexity. How does the complexity scale and measure? And I think that's almost like an interesting, it's probably hard to quantify since like lines of code is always weird. So I think this will always be sort of like a mishmash of like a qualitative metric and a quantitative metric. But I think this is why we're here with effect. We believe there's a better way. And I definitely also take that trade-off.
Yep. That being said, I would also like, why not make Foldkit faster eventually?
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's just that's not the bottleneck to anyone using it right now.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think this was maybe that was the starting point for like other modern takes on what a front-end framework is. And I think it's also like very interesting. And if you build maybe a new chat app that has like millions of messages, maybe that matters more. But I think for like a good catch-all default for like many apps where someone is like effect pilled to begin with, I think this is a very interesting starting point. So I think I got a good understanding now of like the basics of Foldkit. Maybe we can, unless there's like a thing in the app that you wanted to show last. I'm sure there's like ways how to integrate with other great bells and whistles of effect, whether it's like streams and layers, etc. But maybe we can zoom out a little bit and hear more about like your path ahead of like where you're hoping to take Foldkit over the next few years. You've mentioned that your mom knows about it. That's great. Like through this podcast, hopefully a lot more folks find out about it, get to use it. What are you currently looking for? Are you looking for people like using it, giving you feedback? Are you looking for people who actually maybe want to join you building Foldkit, like become contributors and maintainers? Are you looking for people who build ecosystem packages? Let's talk a bit about the future.
Good question. So over the past month or so, I've been really surprised by how much interest there's been in Foldkit. And a lot of this originated with, Tej, do you know on X? I think maybe is that, they posted about it. And that was the first, like, it kind of caused a little bit of a wave of interest. And then I went on Effect Office Hours a couple weeks ago. That was another little wave. And I'm here. And honestly, like I wasn't sure if anyone was going to care about this project or be interested. I just wanted it to exist because I like really like Effect and I feel like there's a gap here. And so I just feel like at this moment, very like grateful that there's any interest. In terms of like where this might go or like what the future looks like, I'm really just focused on getting to a place where I feel really confident saying like, this is version 1 of Foldkit. And I think it's pretty close. Like, I mean, there's a lot of stuff we haven't talked about. There's Foldkit UI, there's story and scene testing in Foldkit, which is, I think, probably one of the coolest things about the framework, honestly. There's like how it works with AI, like over MCP, how just agents work with Foldkit in general. And so like all those pieces are in place, but I'm focused on filling in various gaps before I feel like, okay, like this gets the V1 stamp. And then beyond that, it's really just about like continuing that iterative cycle. Like I don't feel like I know, like, oh, a year from now, this is where I hope the framework is. I don't have any like major expectations, but I think also like the effects community is awesome. Like people are like insanely smart and like want to be helpful and are like always building things. And like, I feel like I'm kind of just like a part of that and trying to contribute and also like riding that wave to some extent. Yeah. I mean, honestly, like that's my take right now.
That is wonderful. I think there's like enough material to do a bunch of like follow-up episodes. Just scrolling through the docs sidebar gives you a taste. Like we've spent most time now like on the basics, getting an intuition for Foldkit. But there's like so many cool things. Like sure, we've like looked at the DOM renderer, but like you seem to have like support for custom elements, which I feel like is a heavily underexplored area of the web. Like even if you would have just said like, hey, my take on Foldkit is like not the data architecture, not effect, but like I'm gonna take a new step of like custom elements or like web components as they were called in the past. I feel like that alone is also like very much worthwhile exploring. Seems like Foldkit works with that. You have a canvas renderer, which is like super cool. This is one of the many areas where you have to completely kind of like opt out of React. And there's like the canvas can do so many interesting things. There's an amazing project called React Glide Data Grid, I think, which I'm using heavily. It's like basically a React data component, like a data grid table component with like infinite rendering, etc. And it's like crazy fast, built by an amazing engineer, Jason at Glide. And there's like in my opinion, like the best like data table component in React. And like the reason why it's so fast is because it's like embraces the canvas.
Interesting.
And like you seem to with Foldkit, like just like allow those things to like interweave with each other. That's like an emergent property of like flipping from the view first to data first. And like the canvas doesn't matter whether the model gets materialized into like rendered as like little like rectangles or lines, or whether some like DOM is re-rendered. So that is super cool. And then like another thing that stood out to me is like you have basically the front end complement to a lot of like concepts that make effect great. Like you have you can take basically the error from your application and render it, etc. So all of that, even though I haven't put on that glove yet, it seems like it might fit like a glove. So I'm very much looking forward to getting my hands on that. And what you've said about the effect community means a lot to me as well, because I have in 2020, when I was one of the first people like to get involved with effect, like one of the biggest downside at that point was like there was like absolutely no community, there was like no ecosystem, etc. Like it had the right ideas, but like everything that the React ecosystem had going for it and all of those other ecosystems, there was just like a void in effect, and that was kind of very daring. And now we have one of the best communities. There is like a really rich ecosystem. Foldkit as an amazing, like very sizable contribution to that ecosystem is just like what makes me and so many other people very excited about effect. So thank you so much for like all of like the love and energy and like countless efforts you're putting into Foldkit. As someone who's building similarly sized projects in the past, and still, I think one of the most important things is like having enough energy to keep going. So I wish you that for the future, and I'm really, really excited to get my own hands on Foldkit and giving it a try, and looking forward to having you back soon.
Thanks. Yeah, that really warms my heart. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Hey, Devin, thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Cause and Effect podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. If you haven't done so already, you can join our Discord community. And if you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions about this episode or about Effect in general, don't hesitate to get in touch. See you in the next episode.